What is your last name? And if you could spell it, please.
Last name is Warren, W-A-R-R-E-N.
First name
Lloyd, L-L-O-Y-D.
and middle initial.
M,
When were you born?
15 July 1945.
Where did you live before you became part of the military?
I was born and raised in a very small town in Texas, a place called Wilmer, W-I-L-M-E-R, Texas.
What branch of service were you part of?
The Army.
Army. How did you get into the service? Did you volunteer? Were you drafted in?
I volunteered. I was going to, well, at that particular time, when I was getting out of college and everything, the draft had just come in, so it was very obvious that I was going to get drafted if I didn't volunteer. Because I wasn't going to go on to college, do master's work or anything of that nature. I was not married, and that pretty well took care of all the things that would have gotten you out of the draft at that time. So I volunteered for the service.
When did your service first start? Around what year?
1966.
Where was your basic training at?
Fort Polk, Louisiana. We had another name for it, but I don't think we want to put that on.
After your basic training, where were you sent for your advanced training?
My advanced training was because one of the things I did was volunteer to go to flight school. And so my advanced training was the U.S. Army Helicopter School. And the primary part of that was at Fort Walters, Texas. And then once you passed through the Fort Walters program, then you went to Fort Rucker, Alabama for the advanced.
Okay. What was your job when you began your military service?
I was an Army helicopter pilot. And that was, shall I say, a full-time job.
What was happening in the world when you were in the military? Was there any war going on, or?
Yes, the Vietnam War was going on. And that was, that is what drove a lot of people to flight school. You had to volunteer to go to flight school. It wasn't something that they would assign you to or anything of that nature. You had to actually volunteer to go to flight school. And there was a severe, I say severe, there was quite a bit of testing, questions, background checks, things of that nature that you had to complete and go through.
How long did you serve in the military?
From 1966 all the way through I always have to stop and think about this, 72. Now that was on active duty. After I got off of active duty, I went into the reserves, and I spent about 7 years in the reserves. But I did something different in the reserves than what I did flying on active duty.
What was the reason for you to get out of the military?
What was the reason?
For you to leave?
Oh, to leave the military? Well, the reason was that I got shot down twice and I crashed once in the military. When I crashed, I got injured with my back. And you have to, in the military, you have to pass flight physicals at least once a year while you're flying. And if you can't pass a flight physical, you can no longer fly. Well, it came time for my last flight physical, and I was going through the process in my mind of trying to decide if I was going to stay in the military or get out. And they told me because of my back injury I couldn't pass a flight physical. And I said, well, if I can't fly, I'm going to get off active duty. So I did.
What engagements can you remember? Any specific engagements in war that you'd like to share?
There were several that were, shall I say, overwhelming. The first one was a place called Doc To, and that is in the Central Highlands in Vietnam. And I spent all of my time in the Central Highlands. And that's when I first got into what we referred to as in country, when I first got into Vietnam, was there. And they were having a significant battle going on, trying to remove some of the North Vietnamese that were there away from the high ground. They weren't mountains, but they were hills, things of that nature. And there was one there, and in Vietnam they had a tendency to, instead of naming a hill or a mountain a name, they put the altitude on it, so it became Hill 875, because the altitude was 875 feet above sea level. And that became a significant battle there. Well, that became my in-country orientation, as we kind of said tongue-in-cheek, so to speak, because it was what told us really that we were in a war. It wasn't going to be the stuff that we learned in flight school and things of that nature, but people were shooting at us. And as we used to say, when you hear that first shot fired in anger, you know it's a whole different world you're in. And we were there for about 2.5 weeks. And that became, as I said, my in-country orientation. From there, the unit that I was with began to move on to our quote-unquote permanent location, which for us was not a permanent location, but I'll get into that in a moment. But we did and moved away from that part of the highlands, but we were still in that area in Vietnam that were referred to as the Central Highlands. It was not very inhabited by large cities or towns or things of that. It was pure jungle, and for the lack of a better term, mountains. Okay, and we got over into a new area, but it was a little closer, located a little closer to the coast of South Vietnam. That didn't really make a whole lot of difference about the geography and things of that nature for us. And at the end of, January, they have a holiday in Vietnam. And that holiday would be, comparatively speaking here, it would be like your birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July, any major holiday that you can think of, it's all rolled into one. And that holiday lasts for a week. And literally, the whole country shuts down. And the North Vietnamese, which were the people we were fighting, and the South Vietnamese, who were our allies, had agreed to having a truce. Well, on the midnight time of when the truce was to start, the North Vietnamese didn't keep their word, and they started attacking. And they attacked every major city in the South. And it became a horrific battle. You talk to anybody who was in country during that time, and by that I'm talking about Tet 68. 1968 is when this occurred, and Tet was the holiday. It means something different to them, and it also can be, people will talk about how long it lasted and stuff, and in certain areas of the country, it lasted maybe 10 days longer than it did someplace else because of the battles and such. For me, it meant it was over 70 days. But what sits in my mind is the fact that for 52 days of those days, that time frame, I never got any time off. So for 52 days, I flew constantly. And when I say I flew, we flew normally during Tet right at 20 hours a day. And that was flight time. That was not the briefing times before, the times afterwards to do the after action reports, checking the aircraft out to see that it was all right for the next day's flight or the next flight it was scheduled for. It was at least 20 hours a day. Also during that time frame, and it wasn't consecutive, but there were 5 days I never even stopped flying. I didn't sleep for those 5 days. Not that you got much sleep if you're working 20 plus hours a day, but I mean, we didn't shut down for anything. We just kept going. And it was a terrific difficult time for us. It really was. Mentally, physically, emotionally. It was a tremendous strain on the equipment, i.e. the helicopters that we had, things of that nature. We lost a large number of aircrew. It was not uncommon to note the loss of the lives that occurred during the Tet, what we referred to as the Tet Offensive. The best way I can describe it for you is, I belong to an organization called the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association. That's the logo. In fact, that's what's on top of my hat there. But the best way I can describe, and they put it out every year, and what they do is they just go back and they contact people that flew helicopters in Vietnam, and they get pictures. So each picture or each month is either a series of pictures or pictures that shows different helicopters. That's the kind of helicopter that I flew. It's the Huey, okay? But my point on the Tet Offensive and such, you'll note in the blocks here, their names listed. Those are names of helicopter pilots that were killed on that day. And it started on the right there is when it started, on that day. And yes, there are days when there's still a significant number of people, but as you look at it, for the entire month of February, those dates are pretty full, and you can even go on into March, and those days, and it just continues on. So it's not an easy way of explaining Tet, but it's one that's visual to people.
Wow.
There were other incidents, conflicts, battles, but Dak To and Tet were the most memorable ones, and the ones that were Well, the hardest ones, if I could say, to get over, I still remember them. Some things you forget, some things you never forget. Tet was one of them.
What do you remember most about your time in service?
The friends that I made, because they were like brothers to me. I'm an only child. I never had any brothers or sisters. But I made friends that are, like I said, they're literally like brothers to me. I have one that lives in Hawaii, and I could pick up the phone today and say, I've got a problem, I need some help, can you come? And he'd be on the next airplane. Got one that lives in Texas, same way. So that's the thing that I remember most, and it's probably one of the things that I value most.
What qualities did you believe you carried from the war to where you are today?
Good question. I think I carry with me things that I learned and things that I knew before, but were supplemented by and strengthened by what I learned. And things like I believe well, if I give my word on something, it becomes a commitment. It becomes a real commitment. Working with people, I feel that it's extremely important that we understand each other, and if I'm working for them, then I have a commitment to them. If they are working for me, they have a commitment to me. It can be things of that nature. It can be how I well, I'll do it in a little tongue-in-cheek way. My wife is a history professor and still teaches, and I give her a very bad time about the fact that every year I have to teach her classes for a week, and that's because that she volunteers me to come in and do basically what we're doing right now today. They want to hear about Vietnam, what happened, what were my experiences, and things of that nature. She teaches 3 different classes, 2 days a week. And so because of the schedule, I usually end up teaching those classes. So I always give her a week off. And we debate about that, but anyway, that's it. But I say that tongue-in-cheek, and because it actually helps me. That helps me because what it did teach me was that I needed to not brag about what I did in Vietnam, but I need to share it so that the next generation and the next generation become aware of it. And what did it mean to the nation, my family, to me, my friends, and I don't know what you all have had so far in your history classes about Vietnam or Southeast Asia?
We haven't got there yet.
Hadn't got there yet? Okay. Well, I've got a couple of things that I use for her class that I'll leave you a copy of, and that may help you very much too, okay?
Thank you. Is it hard talking about like that, talking about the memories and all that every year?
It used to be. My wife is the individual who got me through that in the beginning, because I didn't. I was like just about every vet from Vietnam. We didn't talk. Now, there were a variety of reasons why that happened. For one thing, we didn't think anybody was interested. That's really the bottom line. And people didn't ask. So unlike the guys that came back from World War II, like my dad, they got a hero's welcome. We were looked down upon because it was an unpopular war. It was a war that most of the people in the United States at that time did not want to be involved in. One of the reasons they didn't want to be involved in is because there was a draft and nobody wanted to get drafted. And that's just as blunt as I can put it, because there were people that literally moved to Canada so they wouldn't have to be drafted. In effect, they ran away. I felt not compelled, but I felt like it was my responsibility, because my family had been involved in every war this nation had had, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. They were involved in it in some shape, form, or fashion. And I was born and raised to the fact that it was my duty. And it costs you a lot. And I don't mean just if you survive the time that you have to spend at it and things like that, but it costs you a lot in a lot of different ways. But it's one of those. It's one of those things.
The people you served with, do you ever get back together with them or see them very often?
Mm-hmm. Not nearly as often as I'd like to. I do see them, not, I won't say regularly. I do have friends that, since we have moved from the lake up to Fulton, I've met a couple of people there in Fulton that were Army helicopter pilots in Vietnam. So we've gotten to know each other, and we've on occasion gotten together for dinner, or we just bump into each other on the street, something like that. So yeah, and that goes back to that, what we have in common is that we both flew helicopters. So that becomes a thing for us.
How did you keep in touch with like your family and friends when you were in Vietnam?
In those days, the only way we had of communicating or being communicated with was we had to write letters. And in those days, it took the mail about 3 weeks to get to us. So it wasn't like Mom and Dad go drop something in the mailbox and, oh, I don't know, 4 or 5 days later I get it. Mm-mm. The address was APO, an Army post office in San Francisco. And then from there they took it and they sorted it out to where it might go in locations for for the military. Plus the fact if we were like during TET, we were so busy we didn't have time to read the mail. And so you end up with, here was a stack of letters, and by the time you actually had a time to sit down and read them, they might be almost 2 months old. Well, that's old news, so to speak. But that's the only way we had of communicating. We didn't have telephones, we didn't have computers, we didn't have any of that.
How did you readjust to civil life or civilian life when you got back from Vietnam?
That's probably one of the hardest questions to answer, and I'll be real honest with you. There are still things that I haven't adjusted to, and we're talking about something that happened to me over 50 years ago, and I don't. What I do is that when I can, and I say when I can, fortunately I am retired, and my wife still works 2 days a week teaching, but when I can, I sit on, weather permitting, I guess I would also say, because this time of the year it's kind of, but I sit on our front porch in a rocking chair, and I watch the birds and the squirrels, and I just try to relax and think about the good things, the things that I have that I'm very fortunate to have. I try to block out the things that I don't want to think about, but that's very, very difficult. Some days I'm successful at it, some days I'm not. So I use that to help me make the readjustments that I need to do. I've made friends in Fulton with a group of gentlemen who, there are some that are, I would say collectively a lot of them are my age. Okay, there's one or two that still work. The rest of them are retired, and we meet Monday through Friday, and there's a lot of times you don't have time to go. For example, I didn't go this morning, didn't have time to, for coffee. And we just meet for coffee and talk about each other's kids and grandkids, and talk about you know, what's going on in the world, and things of that nature. That helps. Little things like that helps. Some of those guys were in the military, some of them weren't. As it turns out, there's nobody in that group that had gone to Vietnam but myself. But there are times that that time will come. There will be people that will come in and such. Or we've got a couple of folks who have grandkids, you know, that are in the military now, and they'll bring their grandkids with them when they come. And they always want to know about Vietnam, and I want to know about Afghanistan, and you know, those kinds. So that helps. That's a way that it helps. Having a wonderful wife helps. She's the one that got me talking about the experiences and such. So.
Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview?
Well, I think I always tell my wife when I do her class that the class can ask any questions that they have, and I will answer the questions for them. But my wife can ask no questions. I am so glad that phone rang. One of the things I think I would offer to you is what are the things that, and maybe you have never thought about it, but what are the things that you would like to know, not what the project says you ought to ask about this or that or that, but what are things that you would like to know about a veteran, about their time in the service, things of that nature. And then I'd be happy to answer those questions for you.
What?
Can you turn that off?
Yeah.